The dark marks on Zafira's skin weren't just injuries. They were a blemish on the only thing in the city Kim Do-Hyun found pure. And Do-Hyun was a man who specialized in cleaning up messes. He had spent months as a silent statue in the corner of his own empire, watching her. But the moment her sleeve slipped back to reveal that jagged purple cuff, his clinical detachment died. She stammered a frantic apology about a slippery tray, her eyes darting to the floor in a practiced rhythm of shame. She was already retreating into the shadows, but she didn't realize that by showing him those bruises, she had just handed him a war. The sterile neon blue glow of the vault hummed with the quiet conversation of the city's high-stakes players, men who moved markets with a whisper and guarded their secrets with NDA-backed security. A smooth electronic synth track pulsed through the hidden speakers, a rhythmic contrast to the sudden, cold stillness in Dokhan's chest. He didn't move. He simply watched her navigate the maze of glass tables. He had been studying Zafira Monroe for months, the precise, dignified way she carried herself despite the weight of the world, and the way her breath hitched whenever a patron raised their voice, yet remained steady when he approached. It was as if her soul recognized the difference between a common bully and a true apex predator. To the world, he was a clinical head of a syndicate, but as he watched her adjust her uniform to hide the swelling on her cheek, the next 24 hours of the city's history were already written in blood. The crash of shattering glass was the only sound that dared to interrupt the calculated hum of the vault. At the corner table, 3 of the city's most influential developers froze, their high-stakes negotiation hanging mid-air like a bated breath. But Kim Do-Hyun didn't look at the developers. He didn't look at the $1,000 bottle of vintage scotch now seeping into the Persian rug. His eyes were locked on Zafira. She was on her knees, her breath coming in shallow, jagged hitches that vibrated through the silent room. As she reached down to gather the shards, her silk sleeve rode up, snagging on a piece of glass. It pulled back just enough to reveal the truth. A ring of deep, mottled violet circling her delicate wrist, the unmistakable silhouette of a man's grip. I'm so sorry, Mr. Kim, she whispered, her voice a thin wire about to snap. She didn't look up. She couldn't. Her body was a roadmap of tension, her shoulders hunched as if expecting a blow to follow the accident. Do-Hyun, the lead developer began, tapping a manicured finger on a contract that represented 9 figures of revenue. As we were saying, the zoning permits for the waterfront. Do-Hyun held up a single hand. He didn't turn his head. The gesture was small, but it carried the weight of a guillotine blade. The developer went silent instantly. "The meeting is over," Do-Hyun said. His voice was a low, clinical silk that sent a shiver through the room. "But the contract." "Leave," Do-Hyun commanded, his dark, piercing eyes finally shifting to the men, radiating a cold, predatory promise that made the air in the room feel thin. "Now." The power players didn't argue. They gathered their papers with trembling hands and vanished past the velvet ropes, leaving the lounge in a state of heavy, expectant silence. Do-Hyun rose from his chair, his movements fluid and precise. He stepped over the spilled scotch and the broken glass until he was standing directly over her. Zafira recoiled slightly, her hands flying up near her face in a defensive reflex that told him everything he needed to know. It was a movement born of long-term terror, a muscle memory of survival. He didn't reach for her. He knew better than to touch a wounded bird before it knew he wasn't the hunter. Instead, he knelt, maintaining a respectful distance, his sharp features softening into something unrecognizable to the world outside. "Zafira," he said, the rare name tasting like a vow on his tongue. "Look at me." She slowly raised her head, her dark eyes swimming with fear and a flicker of exhausted strength. The bruise on her cheek was beginning to bloom, a cruel contrast to her radiant skin. "Who did this?" he asked. There was no anger in his tone, only a terrifying, absolute calm. Zafira looked at the man the city called a monster, and for the first time in years, she didn't feel like the prey. She felt the shift in the room, the way his silent protection began to wrap around her like a suit of armor. "He's powerful," she choked out, the first crack in her wall of silence. Do-Hyun's expression didn't change, but his eyes darkened to a shade of midnight. "Not anymore," he replied. "In this city, there is only one power that matters, and you are under it now." The heavy oak door of Do-Hyun's private office clicked shut, sealing out the sterile hum of the lounge. Inside, the air tasted of expensive leather and the cold ozone of high-end servers. Do-Hyun sat behind a desk of polished obsidian, his face a mask of granite. Opposite him, his head of security, Jun-ho, slid a digital tablet across the dark surface. A single face flickered to life on the screen. Marcus Reed. He isn't just a ghost from her past. He's a predator who learned how to hunt using the city's own resources. Do-Hyun leaned forward, his sharp features caught in the blue light of the display. The file was a catalog of systematic destruction. Marcus Reed spent a decade as a decorated detective in the 4th Precinct, but the internal affairs reports, buried under layers of redacted blue wall protection, told a different story. He hadn't just patrolled the streets, he had harvested them. As Do-Hyun scrolled, the clinical details of the investigation began to paint a sickening picture. Reed had met Zafira during a routine canvass 3 years ago. When she had tried to end their brief, suffocating relationship, he hadn't just walked away. He had used his badge like a scalpel, cutting her off from the world. He had filed false reports to get her evicted from her first apartment, flagged her social security number for identity theft to freeze her bank accounts, and intimidated every employer who dared to give her more than 20 hours a week. "He turned the law into a cage," Do-Hyun murmured, his thumb pausing over a photo of a younger, smiling Zafira, her eyes yet to be clouded by the hyper-vigilance he saw every night at the club. "He was forced out of the force 6 months ago," Jun-ho continued, "but only because his brutality became too expensive for the precinct to insure. Now he's a freelance security consultant for the city's underground, a mercenary for hire. He uses his old police contacts to keep Zafira in a state of permanent transit. He wants her desperate. He wants her to believe he's the only person who can stop the problems he's creating." The tablet showed Reed's current location, a fortified loft in the industrial district, paid for by a shell company Do-Hyun knew well. Reed was still using the police database, illegally accessed through a former partner, to track Zafira's every move, even her clock-in times at the vault. Do-Hyun's eyes didn't flicker with anger. They grew frighteningly still. He reached out and touched the screen, his finger resting over Reed's throat. The man wasn't just a bully, he was an insult to the order Do-Hyun maintained. Reed had used a system of justice to inflict cowardice. "He thinks his old badge still protects him," Do-Hyun said, standing up and adjusting the cuffs of his bespoke suit. "He thinks he understands how power works in this city. We are going to remind him that the light of the law is nothing compared to the shadow I cast." The digital clock on the wall of the war room flickered to 12 a.m., its crimson numbers casting a blood-like glow over the faces of the men assembled. Kim Do-Hyun stood at the head of the obsidian table, his posture as rigid as a blade. He didn't look like a man about to commit a crime. He looked like a judge about to hand down a sentence. His 3 primary lieutenants, men who controlled the city's docks, its digital infrastructure, and its silent enforcers, sat in shadow. They had seen Do-Hyun cold, and they had seen him ruthless, but they had never seen him this focused. The air in the room felt heavy, charged with the kinetic energy of a coming storm. "Marcus Reed is a parasite," Do-Hyun began, his voice barely above a whisper, yet it cut through the hum of the cooling fans like a razor. "He has spent years hiding behind a badge, using the city's own veins to poison a woman who belongs to this establishment. He thinks his connections make him untouchable. He thinks the blue wall is thick enough to stop me." He leaned over the table, pressing his palms flat against the surface. "We are not just going to kill him. We are going to erase the world that allows him to breathe. Every officer who took a bribe to bury a report, every landlord who accepted his threats to evict her, every security firm that launders his paychecks, they are all part of the infection. He looked at the clock again, 12:01 a.m. The timer starts now, Do-Hyun declared. I want his bank accounts emptied by dawn. I want his former partners in the 4th Precinct to receive a digital package that makes them choose between their pensions and his head. By the time the sun set tomorrow, I want Marcus Reed to be a ghost in his own city. No money, no friends, no badge to hide behind. And if he fights back? Jun-ho asked, his hand instinctively twitching toward the holster beneath his jacket. Do-Hyun's eyes flashed with a terrifying, absolute certainty. Let him. A man who fights for his life is predictable. A man who realizes his life is already over is a spectacle. By this time tomorrow, Marcus Reed will not exist. Neither will those who helped him. The city needs to be reminded of what happens when someone touches what is mine. He straightened his silk tie, the gesture final and clinical. Zafira will have her first night of peaceful sleep in 3 years. Do not fail me. As the lieutenants rose and vanished into the night to begin the systematic dismantling of a man's existence, Do-Hyun remained alone in the red glow. He picked up a single shard of glass he had saved from the lounge floor, a sharp, clear reminder of the debt that was about to be paid in full. The digital assaults began in the silent, chilled server room beneath the lounge, where the only light was the rhythmic blinking of high-velocity processors. Isabella, Do-Hyun's lead architect of shadows, moved her fingers across the keys with the grace of a concert pianist. On the wall-sized monitors, Marcus Reed's life was reduced to rows of glowing green code, a digital fortress that was about to be leveled. Initiating the wipe, Isabella murmured. With a single keystroke, the blue wall protection Reed had enjoyed for years didn't just crack, it dissolved. First went the bank accounts. In the industrial district, blocks away, Marcus Reed sat in his darkened loft, his phone buzzing with a series of frantic notifications. He watched in frozen horror as his balance plummeted from 6 figures to 0 in less than 30 seconds. Every cent he had extorted, every bribe he had laundered, was rerouted into an untraceable offshore charity for victims of domestic violence. Next, Isabella targeted his identity. One by one, Reed's credentials vanished from the state's databases. His driver's license was flagged as a fraudulent duplicate. His concealed carry permit was revoked by a phantom internal affairs order. Even his digital footprint on social platforms was replaced by a rolling feed of his own redacted misconduct reports. To the world's servers, Marcus Reed was no longer a decorated ex-cop. He was a high-risk anomaly. By 3 a.m., the paranoia began to set in. Reed tried to call his former partner at the precinct, but his phone line had been hijacked. No matter what number he dialed, the only thing he heard on the other end was the smooth, looping synth track from The Vault. It was a psychological noose, tightening with every unanswered ring. He looked out his window, seeing the blacked-out SUVs idling at the edge of the street, their headlights like the eyes of deep-sea predators waiting for him to surface. Isabella leaned back, her face illuminated by the final confirmation screen. He's offline, boss. He's a ghost in a machine that doesn't recognize his name anymore. Do-Hyun, standing behind her with his arms crossed, watched the monitor as Reed's last remaining safe house security system was remotely disarmed. The man who had used the system to trap Zafira was now trapped by the system itself. He'll start to run now, Do-Hyun said, his voice cold and devoid of pity. And the more he runs, the more noise he'll make. Let him feel what she felt, the sensation of the world shrinking until there is nowhere left to hide. The city's infrastructure, once Reed's playground, had become his cage. As the hackers closed the final back doors into his life, Marcus Reed was left in total darkness, a man with no money, no name, and no way out. By 4 a.m., the calculated silence of the city was replaced by a rising chorus of sirens. From the glass-walled balcony of his penthouse, Kim Do-Hyun watched the flashing strobes of red and blue pulse through the DC streets like a fever. He held a crystal glass of water, his expression as impassive as the skyline he overlooked. The cleansing had transitioned from the digital realm to the physical world, and the city was beginning to bleed. The purge was surgical. At a high-end gated community, two of Marcus Reed's former partners were led out in handcuffs, not by Do-Hyun's men, but by federal agents. The digital package Isabella had sent, containing years of recorded bribes, falsified evidence logs, and private messages detailing their cooperation with Reed, had left the department with no choice but to devour its own pack. The blue wall hadn't just been breached, it had been turned into a cage. As the sirens wailed, the panic moved like a shockwave through the underworld. Every landlord who looked the other way when Reed harassed Zafira found their buildings swarmed by fire marshals and tax investigators, their assets frozen by administrative anomalies. Every street-level informant Reed had used to track her was being picked up by Do-Hyun's silent enforcers, questioned with terrifying efficiency, and discarded. In the heart of the chaos, the city's power elite began to understand the message. This wasn't a gang war, it was a demonstration of absolute sovereignty. Do-Hyun was showing the city that the laws they thought governed them were merely suggestions when compared to the safety of those under his protection. Inside the safe house, Zafira stood by the window, her hand resting against the cool glass. She could hear the sirens, a sound that used to make her heart stutter with the fear that Reed was coming for her. But tonight, the rhythm was different. The sirens weren't hunting her, they were hunting the man who had made her life a nightmare. Her phone buzzed on the table behind her, a single text from an unknown number. The city is waking up to a different world. Sleep, Zafira. The dawn belongs to you. She looked out at the flashing lights, and for the first time in 3 years, the tension in her shoulders began to dissolve. Outside, the night was loud and violent, but inside the circle Do-Hyun had drawn around her, there was only peace. Marcus Reed was losing his city, his allies, and his mind, one siren at a time. The predator was now the prey, and the entire city was watching him fall. The rain began as a fine mist, blurring the neon lights of the city into long, bleeding streaks of violet and blue. Inside the safe house, the air was still, smelling faintly of vanilla and the ozone of the storm outside. Zafira sat on the edge of the velvet sofa, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, until the sound of a key turning in the deadbolt made her heart leap into her throat. Kim Do-Hyun stepped inside, his long black overcoat slick with rain. He looked like a shadow that had finally detached itself from the night. He didn't speak immediately. He simply stood there, his piercing eyes scanning her face for any new sign of distress. Finding none but the fading yellow of the old bruise, he closed the door and approached with the quiet, predatory grace that was his hallmark. He placed 2 items on the marble coffee table between them. The first was a sleek, unbranded burner phone. The second was a small, compact pistol, its chrome finish gleaming like a surgical instrument under the recessed lighting. "The city is in chaos, Zafira," he said, his voice a low, clinical hum. "Marcus Reed is a cornered animal. He has lost his money, his allies, and his badge. But a cornered animal is at its most dangerous when it realizes it has nothing left to lose." Zafira looked at the chrome weapon, her breath hitching. I don't think I can." "You have spent 3 years being hunted," Do-Hyun said, stepping closer until she could smell the cold rain and expensive tobacco clinging to his coat. He didn't reach out to touch her, but his presence felt like a physical weight, a barrier between her and the world. "I have dismantled his life, but I cannot crawl inside his mind and stop his desperation. If he finds a way past my men, if the shadows fail you, I need you to be the one who ends it." He picked up the burner phone. "One button connects to me. No matter where I am, no matter what I am doing, I will answer. He set it down and then gestured to the pistol. This is not a threat. It is the weight of your own life, finally placed back into your hands. Do not fear the steel, Zafira. Fear the version of yourself that remains a victim. Zafira looked at the weapon, to Do-Hyun's calculated, emotionless face. In his eyes, she saw a reflection of her own quiet strength, a fire he had recognized long before she had. She reached out, her fingers trembling as they brushed the cool, hard metal of the chrome grip. As she pulled the weapon toward her, the weight of it felt grounding, a sharp anchor in the storm of the last 24 hours. "I won't be a victim again," she whispered, her voice gaining a sudden, jagged edge of steel. Do-Hyun nodded once, a ghost of a smile touching the corner of his mouth. It was the look of a king who had just watched a queen realize her own power. "Then the hunt is almost over," he said, turning back toward the door. "Keep the phone on you. The night is far from finished." The industrial district was a wasteland of rusting iron and deep, oily shadows. Inside his fortified loft, Marcus Reed paced the length of the floor, his boots crunching on broken glass. The silence of the room was louder than any siren. He reached for the light switch, but the power had been severed hours ago. He reached for his backup burner, but there was no signal, only the faint, ghostly echo of that same electronic synth track from the vault playing on a loop, mocking him from the dead air. He was sweating, a cold, greasy film that made his shirt cling to his spine. For a decade, Reed had been the one who dictated the terms of fear. He knew how to squeeze a person until they popped. He knew which levers of the law to pull to make a life vanish. But as he peered through the slats of his boarded-up window, he realized the levers were gone. The blue wall hadn't just cracked, it had been weaponized against him. Every contact he had, men who owed him their lives and their dirty secrets, had gone dark. A black sedan glided past the street lamp below, silent as a shark in deep water. It didn't stop. It didn't speed up. It just circled. Reed felt the walls of the loft closing in. He realized then that this wasn't a police sting. If it were the feds, they would have kicked the door down by now. This was something clinical. This was Kim Do-Hyun. "She's just a waitress," Reed hissed into the darkness, his voice cracking with a frantic, high-pitched edge. "She's a nobody." But the realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. Zafira wasn't a nobody, not to the man who was currently burning Reed's world to the ground. Reed had thought he was playing a game of cat and mouse with a vulnerable woman, but he had inadvertently stepped into the territory of an apex predator who didn't care about rules, badges, or due process. He looked at his empty safe. He looked at his dead phone. The paranoia blossomed into a full-scale panic, a jagged heat rising in his throat. He wasn't being arrested, he was being erased. The city he once owned was now a massive, interconnected trap, and Do-Hyun was the one with his hand on the trigger. Desperation finally overrode his training. He couldn't stay here and wait to be snuffed out like a candle. He grabbed a heavy jacket and his service weapon, the only thing he had left that still felt real. He didn't care about the money anymore. He didn't even care about escaping the city. He wanted to hurt the only thing Do-Hyun seemed to value. If he was going to burn, he would make sure Zafira Monroe was the fuel. He slipped out the back exit, unaware that every step he took was being tracked by the very shadows he was trying to outrun. The storm outside had reached a fever pitch, thunder rattling the window panes of the safe house in a rhythmic, violent cadence. Inside, the lights flickered once, then died, plunging the suite into a thick, suffocating velvet. In the sudden silence, the sound of a heavy boot striking the service door echoed through the hallway like a gunshot. Zafira stood in the center of the darkened living room, her heart hammering against her ribs, a wild bird trapped in a cage. In her right hand, the chrome pistol felt impossibly heavy, its cold surface the only thing keeping her grounded. She didn't retreat to the bedroom. She didn't hide. She watched the shadows of the foyer until the wood groaned and the lock gave way with a sickening snap. Marcus Reed stumbled into the room, a ghost of the man who had once terrorized her. He was drenched, smelling of copper and desperation, his eyes bloodshot and wide with a manic flickering light. He held his service weapon with a trembling hand, waving it at the darkness. "Zafira!" he roared, his voice cracking. "I know you're here. You think he can protect you? You think a few sirens and a frozen bank account change what you are to me?" 3 miles away, in the silent glow of the command center, Kim Do-Hyun sat motionless. His eyes were fixed on a high-definition thermal monitor that rendered the scene in shades of ghostly blue and burning orange. Beside him, Jun-Ho held his hand over a remote detonator that would flood the safe house with a neurosedative gas in seconds. One word from Do-Hyun would end this. But Do-Hyun remained still, his jaw tight, his eyes tracing the heat signature of Zafira's steady stance. He saw her raise the chrome weapon. He saw the way her breathing slowed as she found the center of her own fear. He wasn't just watching a confrontation, he was watching a rebirth. "He's nothing but a ghost, Zafira," Reed screamed, kicking a chair aside. "He's watching you die, and he isn't doing a damn thing." Reed turned toward the center of the room, the muzzle of his gun searching the dark. The lightning flared, illuminating the apartment in a jagged white flash. For a split second, the two were caught in a frozen tableau, the cornered rat and the woman who had finally stopped running. Do-Hyun leaned closer to the screen, his fingers digging into the leather of his chair. Every instinct he possessed screamed at him to intervene, to shield her, to take the kill for himself. But he knew that for Zafira to truly be free, she had to be the one to extinguish the shadow. He watched her finger tighten on the trigger, the chrome reflecting the dying embers of the city's light. "I'm not yours, Marcus." Her voice rang out steady and cold as a winter morning. "And I'm not afraid." The thunderous crack of the chrome pistol had silenced the storm, and with it, the ghost of Marcus Reed. By the time the police, the clean ones, sent by Do-Hyun's reach, had cleared the body and the city's headlines had pivoted to the unprecedented fall of a corrupt ring, the air in D.C. felt different. It was lighter, purged of a specific kind of rot. 1 week later, the velvet ropes of the vault parted not for a guest, but for a revolution. The lounge was bathed in its signature neon blue glow, the electronic synth track pulsing with a steady, confident heart. At the corner table, Kim Do-Hyun sat in his usual throne of shadow, a glass of untouched scotch before him. His sharp features were as calculated as ever, but his gaze was fixed entirely on the entrance. Zafira Monroe walked through the doors and the room seemed to tilt on its axis. She was no longer wearing the muted, subservient uniform of a waitress. She was draped in a floor-length gown of midnight silk that shimmered like oil on water, her shoulders bare and unburdened. The purple bruises had faded, replaced by skin that glowed under the club's lights, but the real transformation was in her stride. She didn't look at the floor. She didn't recoil when a tray of glasses clattered in the distance. She moved with a rhythmic, quiet power that commanded the space around her. The patrons, the city's elite who had watched the cleansing with bated breath, fell silent as she passed. They didn't see a victim. They saw the woman who had survived the monster and caught the eye of the king. She reached Do-Hyun's table and paused. For a moment, the clinical mask he wore slipped, revealing a flicker of raw, unadulterated pride. He didn't rise to offer her a chair. He rose to offer her his side. "The city is quiet tonight," Do-Hyun said, his voice a low, intimate silk that reached only her. "The city is finally listening," her voice replied. Her voice was no longer a thin wire. It was a blade, tempered and sharp. She looked at him, not with the gratitude of a subject, but with the steady eyes of an equal. She had seen his darkness, and he had seen her fire, and in the wreckage of the last 24 hours, they had found a common language. Do-Hyun reached out, his hand hovering in the air between them, a silent question. Zafira didn't hesitate. She placed her hand in his, her fingers steady against his skin. As he led her to the seat beside him, the seat that oversaw the entire empire, the message to the city was clear. The hunt was over. The waitress was gone, and beside the man who terrified the city stood the only woman who didn't flinch in his shadow. Zafira Monroe had reclaimed her life, and in the cold, neon heart of the vault, a new reign had begun.